You are sitting in complete silence. Nothing is wrong. Nobody is threatening you. The day is ordinary, and then, out of nowhere, a thought appears that disturbs you so deeply you wonder, what is wrong with you? A violent image, a shameful fantasy, an urge to do something you would never actually do, a sudden fear that you might hurt someone you love, a thought so dark, so strange, so completely at odds with who you believe yourself to be, that you immediately try to push it away, hope nobody can somehow sense it, and spend the rest of the day quietly wondering if you are secretly a terrible person. You are not. What you just experienced has a name. It is called an intrusive thought, and according to research, approximately 94% of the global population experiences them. The thoughts that seem most disturbing, most shameful, most impossible to admit are among the most common experiences in all of human psychology. What you do with those thoughts, however, how you respond to them, what meaning you assign to them, determines whether they remain a passing moment of human experience or become something that quietly dominates your life. To understand intrusive thoughts, you first need to understand something fundamental about how your brain actually works, something most people have never been taught. Your brain does not turn off, ever. Not even when you are trying to rest, not even when you are trying to meditate, not even when you are doing something completely unrelated to thinking. Neuroscientists discovered a network in the brain called the default mode network, a set of interconnected regions that become active specifically when you are not focused on an external task. When you are daydreaming, when you are remembering the past or imagining the future, when your mind is, as we say, wandering, this network is extraordinarily active. It consumes more energy than almost any focused task, and it generates a constant stream of thoughts, images, memories, scenarios, and associations, most of which never reach conscious awareness. They simply flow beneath the surface, part of the vast, ongoing background processing that keeps your mind functional. Intrusive thoughts are simply the moments when one of those background processes surfaces unexpectedly into conscious awareness, not because. The question that haunts most people who experience distressing intrusive thoughts is not simply, why am I having this thought? It is something deeper and more painful than that. It is, what does this thought say about me? If I imagine something violent, am I violent? If I had a thought that crossed a moral line, does that make me a person who crosses moral lines? If I experienced a fleeting urge I would never act on, does the urge itself reveal something dark and true about my character? This is where psychology has something genuinely liberating to offer, because the research is absolutely clear on this point. The content of an intrusive thought tells you almost nothing about the character of the person having it. In fact, and this is one of the most important findings in the entire field, the people who are most disturbed by their intrusive thoughts, who feel the most guilt and shame about them, who would be most horrified to act on them, are typically the people who are most morally conscientious. The violent thought disturbs you precisely because you are not a violent person. The shameful fantasy horrifies you precisely because it conflicts with your genuine values. The presence of the thought is not evidence of who you are. The distress it causes you is the evidence of who you are. For most people, intrusive thoughts are uncomfortable but manageable. Unwelcome guests that arrive occasionally cause temporary distress and eventually pass. The thought comes, it disturbs. You notice it, and over time, if you do not engage with it too intensely, it fades. But for a significant portion of the population, this process goes wrong in a very specific way. And that going wrong has a clinical name: obsessive-compulsive disorder. OCD is widely misunderstood, popularly associated with cleanliness and organization, when in fact its defining feature is a particular relationship with intrusive thoughts. In OCD, the intrusive thought arrives, and instead of being observed and allowed to pass, it is treated as meaningful, as a signal, as something that requires a response. That response, the compulsion, might be a physical behavior, like checking or cleaning or repeating, or it might be mental, reassurance-seeking, analyzing the thought, trying to figure out what it means, trying to prove to yourself that you would never act on it. And here is the cruel irony: at the heart of OCD, every compulsion performed in response to an intrusive thought teaches the brain that the thought was worth responding to, which makes the thought more likely to return, which creates more distress, which demands more compulsions, a cycle that can expand until it consumes enormous portions of a person's life. Even for people who do not meet the clinical threshold for OCD, intrusive thoughts and anxiety exist in a relationship that is worth understanding, because understanding it is what breaks the cycle. Anxiety is at its core a threat detection system. Its job is to scan your environment, including your internal environment, for anything that might be dangerous, and to sound an alarm when it finds something. When anxiety is calibrated correctly, this is extraordinarily useful. It keeps you safe. It motivates you to prepare. It prevents you from ignoring real warnings. But anxiety can become miscalibrated. It can begin treating thoughts as if they were threats, as if the mere presence of a disturbing image in your mind were as dangerous as a physical threat in the external world. When this happens, the intrusive thought triggers anxiety. The anxiety makes the thought feel more significant and dangerous. The increased significance brings more attention to the thought. More attention brings more thoughts. More thoughts bring more anxiety. You are no longer responding to a thought. You are caught in a loop, one where your own mind's attempt to protect you from the thought is the very thing keeping it alive. The counterintuitive and thoroughly research-supported solution to intrusive thoughts is not to fight them, suppress them, analyze them, or try to understand what they mean about you. It is to accept them, not to accept the content of the thought as true or desirable or reflective of your values, but to accept the thought as a thought, a mental event, no more and no less, arising and passing in the stream of consciousness like any other. This is the core principle of acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the most evidence-based psychological approaches of the past 3 decades. The goal is not to eliminate unwanted thoughts. The goal is to change your relationship with them, to step back from the thought and observe it rather than becoming fused with it will generate today, nothing more. In practice, this might sound like, I notice I am having the thought that, not, I am thinking that, but I notice I am having the thought that. That small linguistic shift creates psychological distance. It moves you from being inside the thought to being the observer of the thought. And from that position of observation, the thought loses much of its power. It becomes simply what it always was, a thought, one of the tens of thousands your mind. Mindfulness, one of the most studied psychological interventions of the past several decades, works on intrusive thoughts through a mechanism that is elegant in its simplicity. Most of the suffering caused by intrusive thoughts does not come from the thoughts themselves. It comes from what happens after the thought, the judgment, the analysis, the self-interrogation, the attempt to figure out what the thought means and whether it says something terrible about you, the effort to push it away, the frustration when it returns. Mindfulness teaches a different relationship with mental content. It teaches you to observe thoughts as events in consciousness, arising, existing briefly, and passing without treating them as commands, revelations, or reflections of your identity. The classic metaphor is of sitting on a riverbank and watching thoughts flow past like leaves on the current. You notice each leaf. You do not jump into the river to grab it. You do not attempt to push it upstream. You simply watch it arrive and watch it pass. This practice, which sounds deceptively simple and is actually extraordinarily difficult, changes the brain over time. Research shows measurable changes in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala after consistent mindfulness practice, resulting in reduced reactivity to unwanted thoughts and decreased overall anxiety. Perhaps the heaviest part of living with distressing, intrusive thoughts is not the thoughts themselves, but the silence around them, because these are not the kinds of thoughts people share at dinner. They are not the contents of ordinary conversation. There is no culturally accepted way to say, I keep having a thought that frightens me and I don't know what it means and I am ashamed that I am having it. And so people carry them alone, assuming that their experience is unique, that everyone else's mind is quieter, cleaner, more orderly, that if anyone knew the contents of their inner world, they would be horrified. This shame, the shame of the secret mind, is often more damaging than the thoughts themselves, because shame requires hiding, and hiding requires energy, and the energy spent maintaining the performance of a mind that is not troubled is energy unavailable for actually living. When people discover, usually through therapy or through research like this, that their intrusive thoughts are not unique but nearly universal, the relief can be profound. Not because anything has changed about the thoughts, but because the isolation dissolves, because the secret turns out to be something almost every human shares. And shared experience, even of the most uncomfortable kind, is the beginning of healing. Here is where the science becomes genuinely counterintuitive, and where most people make the mistake that turns a passing thought into a persistent problem. In 1987, social psychologist Daniel Wegner conducted a now famous experiment. He told participants one simple thing: do not think about a white bear. For 5 minutes, think about anything you like, but not a white bear. The result was immediate and consistent. Participants thought about the white bear constantly. More than control groups who had been given no such instruction. And when the restriction was lifted, when they were finally allowed to think about the white bear, they thought about it even more compulsively than before. Wegner called this the ironic process theory, and it reveals something crucial about the mind. The act of trying to suppress a thought makes that thought stronger, more frequent, and more emotionally charged. Every time you have a disturbing thought and try to push it away, but every time you say to yourself, not that thought, go away, you are doing the mental equivalent of pressing on a bruise to make it stop hurting. The suppression is the problem. The resistance is what gives the thought its power. Your mind is not broken. The thoughts that disturb you most are not windows into a dark truth about your character. They are the predictable, documented, nearly universal output of a human brain doing exactly what human brains do. The content of an intrusive thought tells you almost nothing. What tells you everything is what you do next. If you fight the thought, it grows. If you analyze it for hidden meaning, it stays. If you treat it as evidence of who you are, it becomes a cage. But if you observe it, if you name it without judgment, if you allow it to exist as simply a thought, one of tens of thousands, arising and passing, demanding nothing of you, it loses its grip. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, and then more completely than you currently. Every Sunday we go somewhere. Real Mind Decoded. See you next week. fundamentally undisturbed by anything the mind produces, is who you actually are. Subscribe.